Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to another live stream with your host, Brandon Hicks, for the Orange Guild. So, I hope everybody had a wonderful 4th of July if you were in the States. I had some homemade ribs that worked on, and they were fantastic. So, hope you guys had a good day. And we are back tonight. So, let's talk a little bit about where we are tonight and what we're going to be working on. We're going to be picking up the project with the hand sculpted pipe that we were working on in Blender. I'm going to be talking about how to add details to the pipe tonight. A couple of more techniques we haven't gone over before in the live stream sessions. And then tomorrow night, we're going to be jumping into a preview of Blender 2.8, the newly released alpha version. And so I haven't downloaded it yet, haven't played with it much. I played with a really early version a couple of months back, but I haven't had a chance to dig into all the new features yet. So I'm really excited. I'm going to try to walk you guys through some of the exciting new changes that are happening with 2.8. So I hope you're excited. It's going to be a bit of a learning curve, but it's a good learning curve because there's so many amazing new features that are coming out with the 2.8 release. So just so you guys are aware, I sent out an email about this, but so the alpha has already hit. It hit a couple of days ago. The beta will be out for Blender 2.8 on August 12th. And then on October 20th, about a week before the Blender conference in Amsterdam, they're going to be releasing the first RC1 release candidate for Blender 2.8, which at that point basically means that we're nearing the final release of what 2.8 will look like for everybody else in the world. So super pumped. But tonight we're going to talk about sculpting some more. And specifically, we're going to talk about details on the pipe because there's some other techniques we're going to get into. So let me switch my screen over here so I can share with you guys. Okay, so right now we're in Photoshop. And this is a little render that I created so I could kind of catch you guys up on what's been going on with the pipe over the past week or so since we started talking about this, and kind of the direction that things have started to head. So you can see we've added quite a bit more in terms of detail. We finished out some of these main body areas with, hardened creased edges, things like that for these panels. I went in and added some smaller details this afternoon with some of these vents on the side. Created a little window that would be here. And then there's obviously a lot going on here with the propulsion system on the right side. We also jumped in and talked a little bit about how to add some pores and things on the other side of the model that you can't see right now. But I also want to talk about how I did this afternoon, which was a really quick process. But I used a little bit of a different technique. So let's kind of get in here and see what's going on. One thing I want to mention as we jump into Blender tonight is that I am nearing some pretty large polygon counts for the sculpture. This afternoon I was at over 6 million in the viewport. I've been up to 8 so far on this project in really heavy times on sculpting. So what I did was I basically took the whole mesh, went into the modifiers over here, and I added a decimate modifier. And I'm not going to do it to this current model because I don't want Blender to slow down or anything like that, but I will show you on another layer kind of what that looks like. So if we go to a blank layer, let's add in a, let's see about the monkey perhaps. Okay, and let's say I've already added a subsurf modifier and worked on her and it's a finished model. So we've applied this and, I'm sculpting, and there's, instead of, 31,000 polys here, let's say there's, millions and millions. And in fact, if we keep subdividing this, we can actually get it up to a pretty high number here. So just by adding another subdivider, subsurf modifier here, you can see how many polys we're getting in here. Now this is quite heavy at this point. And so the problems that you're going to start running into when you near, a heavy poly scene, and it's going to be different depending on specific factors with your system. Two things to think about here is in object mode, Blender does a lot better job handling higher poly counts. So I've seen tens of millions of polys in object mode with a heavy scene, and you can zoom around quickly and it still works fine. Problem is when you get into sculpt mode and you start kind of working on things with higher poly counts of upwards of 8 million, 10 million, whatever, Blender starts to kind of chug a little bit. And you're going to notice this when you switch the dynamic topology on and off. You're going to notice when you switch back and forth between object mode and edit mode or sculpt mode. And so it's going to start slowing you down, and especially when you start using tools that are at higher resolutions here. So one of the ways to combat this is to decimate your mesh. And what that basically means is you add this modifier over here in object mode called decimate. And decimate is basically going to try to lower the polygon counts so you're not dealing with so many millions of polys here. And it's going to try to keep the shape basically the same so that it's only taking out the polygons that are kind of excessive. So the way this works is you've got a few modes here. The ratios is basically saying what percentage of polygons do you want to keep from the original mesh. So what I did for my sculpture earlier was I lowered this by 75% by typing in a 0.25 there, meaning I want to keep 25% of the polygons around. And it's going to do some calculations. You can see that it looks like it's frozen, but it's just thinking. So I'm going to give this a second to kind of go through here and calculate some things. And we'll pray again that it doesn't crash. But this is something you got to be aware of. And again, why it's so important to do things like decimate your mesh, because you need to pay attention to that so that you don't have as many bugs and as many crashes as you get into these higher poly counts. So you can see we're at a couple of million. This took it down to about 1 million. And this will tell you how many faces here as well. So you can play with this number. It's a decimal number. And you can also use vertex groups to only decimate parts of your mesh. If you want to keep certain areas intact, you can use vertex groups like that, symmetry options and all of that sort of stuff. But anyways, that's the kind of secret tool that I would use if your meshes are getting super dense and heavy in sculpt mode. And then you can just apply that and it will make this permanent. And you can see if we jump into wireframe mode after this applies, that our mesh is quite a bit less dense. Now we're still at 1 million polys, so again, you'll have to weigh. I went from about 6 this afternoon to down to about 1.5, which is a pretty significant reduction, and sped things up quite a bit. And we'll also talk about some other techniques tonight that can help you speed things up as you go. Okay, so after that's applied, you're not going to notice a huge difference if you jump into wireframe mode here, but we did lower the resolution quite a bit here. So that's how that works. Now, I could show you the mesh, but I feel like Blender would crash, so I'm not going to turn that layer on. But what's interesting is that I basically was able to maintain pretty much all the detail that was there, even though it was about 1/6 of the size in terms of density. So yeah. So Lorian is in the chat. Good to see you tonight, Lorian. She's asking, is decimate a permanent reduction? And the answer is yes. So as long as the modifier is active, you can play with it and it's live. But anytime you take a modifier and you throw something on and then hit apply, you're going to have to either undo that. If it was something you just did and it was an accident, you're going to undo it. But it's permanent at that point. So definitely something to be aware of there. Okay, so up until now, we've talked about a lot of different ways to get in here and sculpt on the mesh. You've seen 2 or 3 streams of me jumping in to sculpt mode and playing with all the different tools. And we talked about going from general to specific and how important that is, because otherwise it's hard to maintain consistent detail and you end up adding way too many polygons early on that you don't need. And then it's very hard to keep straight lines. And I've even struggled with that a little bit on this mesh just because I got a little bit ahead of myself early on. So it's that constant discipline of making sure that you're paying attention and plugging in, and it's just a lot of practice making sure that you're getting that in there. So, but we've talked about dynamic topology quite a bit, and that's been the primary method we've used to sort of selectively add detail into specific areas of this mesh. And as I turn on my other layers here, let me switch my tool back here and turn on this layer. You can see that I also went in and modeled this section of the sort of propulsion system. And this is not a sculpture. These were all models using subdivision surface modifier modeling techniques. And so I'll jump in there and show you the geometry and kind of what I did there. Same thing this afternoon, I went ahead and added the little window down here for the side of the ship. And I also went in and played a little bit with adding some sort of a wooden wood grain texture to the stem of the pipe here. You'll notice on the other side that I've cleared off all of the detail that we had back there, smoothed it back out, and given myself sort of a clean palette to kind of play with. The micro details that we're adding with the pores and everything need to kind of be added last because they're the smallest amount of detail that we have on this pipe. So we need to think about that as we go and make sure that we're considering from biggest to smallest, what's the next area we need to focus on. So the concept has kind of morphed and changed a little bit as we've gone. I moved the hole for the tobacco or whatever up here to the fronts, working on getting that in there and smoothing that out. You'll notice that duplicated this little fin over to the side. This one is a little bit more blocky in line with the concept, and that everything on this other side is going to be a little bit less done up, not as many details. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. So Lauren is asking, what about the giant octopus? That's still coming, but since that's a separate part of the mesh, we're going to have to get in there and model that as well. And so if we have time tonight, maybe we can jump in there and take a look at some of the ways we might get that in there and block that in. I don't mind doing that if that was helpful for you guys. But as we go, just let me know if you want me to stop and kind of hover a little bit longer on some area. And I'm happy to talk about my workflow a little bit as we get in here on these details. So as I was saying, basically we've talked mostly about the method for using dynamic topology. There's actually another way you can sculpt details in Blender that is using a different workflow. And so for some of these other objects, like the stem, I'm going to show you a separate workflow that is still sculpting, but it is a little bit different of a workaround for how you control your density of your polygons. So let's talk a little bit about how to do that. One of the things I want to keep in mind as I'm concepting this sculpture is that even though I've been concentrating most of my attention on this main body of the ship, that's not the only areas that are going to need detail. We're going to need to kind of make the rest of these look like they're made out of specific materials. If these are supposed to be carved out of the same sepia-like material that we have here for this pipe, then those are going to need to get pores, and get scratched up and all sorts of other stuff like that, just like this main body would. I decided for the stem here that I wanted to do more of like a wooden texture and make it sort of a different material than the rest of this. And so this is going to maybe be varnished or something, and we'll do a dark cherry wood or something like that for the stem here. But you can see we've kind of sculpted in some wood grain. And let's talk a little bit about how I did that. So I'm going to jump back into object mode. And I'm going to show you a separate workflow. So if I select the stem here, you can see that I've got a new modifier that we haven't gone over yet called multi-resolution added to this mesh. And rather than go through and show you on the stem, because I've already sculpted this and it's finished, I'm going to pick another object to work on, and we can go in there and sculpt on that. So let's pick this one over here. And here's the way the multi-resolution works. Typically with any of these modeled objects that I'm not sculpting on in the beginning, I've created polygonal models, and then I've added a subsurf modifier to smooth them out. So if I turn this off, you can see how sort of blocky this is. And then as I turn this on, you can see how that sort of smooths that out while adding geometry. See all the extra polygons there. Well, multi-resolution kind of does the same thing as the subsurf modifier does. So if I were to turn this off and then add the multi-resolution modifier, this has to be the first modifier at the very top of the stack. It's just one of the rules that goes along with how this works. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but it will give you a warning if you try to move this around. So if I try to move the subsurf above the multi-res, it's going to tell me that I can't do that. So just remember that, and if you don't, Blender obviously will get you and tell you. But basically with multi-res, what we can do is we can subdivide just like we would here with subdivision level. So if we just click subdivide 2 or 3 times, you can actually see in wireframe what's happening. So if I turn this off and then I turn the original subsurf back on, you can see it pretty much does the same thing in terms of smoothing this out. So it looks like the same modifier, but in reality, there is a lot of different features to this one versus this one. So I'm going to get rid of the subsurf here, and let's just talk about multi-res. So going through these options, we have the same Catmull-Clark versus simple subdivision. Simple subdivision is basically not going to smooth. It's just going to subdivide. So all the polygons are still there. But if you switch this over to Catmull-Clark, it changes the algorithm for the smoothing operation. And it's going to kind of average all the vertices and smooth these edges out for you. And so that part is exactly identical to the subsurf modifier. And then the preview settings are the same. So you can turn this up or down depending on what you want to see in your viewport here. And then we have another setting here for sculpt, which means in sculpt mode, this is what resolution we're previewing. And then we have another setting here, which is the same as in the subsurf modifier, which is how many subdivisions to use as we render the object. So if you want to change these and keep them individually dialed in, you can do that. And then we have a whole slew of other options over here that are related to how we sculpt. So let's talk a little bit about how that works. If I jump into sculpt mode with the multi-res modifier turned on, you'll see that in wireframe, we've got that extra resolution added. And so now if I jump in here and I start sculpting on this model, we're not going to use the dynamic topology. We're going to leave that turned off. And instead, we're using this multi-res modifier to control our resolution. And so we can start sculpting on an area, and I'm going to need to turn my strength up quite a bit here. So you can see how this is working. And if we don't like the level of detail here, we can actually just keep subdividing this until we get a high enough resolution detail that our strokes are showing up the way that we are wanting them to. And you'll notice as I rotate around, it's a little faster than when we're using dynamic topology because we've got this fast navigate turned on right here. So if we uncheck that, it's not going to show a super low resolution preview. But if that's slowing down, that's something good to keep checked off. And you'll notice that that'll return to normal as you stop rotating in the 3D viewport. So the big difference here is, again, we are subdividing manually. It's not going to selectively subdivide areas of your mesh. It's going to subdivide the entire mesh altogether. So you don't have individual stroke control over how you're adding resolution like you do with the dynamic topology menu here. It's just going to subdivide everything, just in one giant go. And so sometimes, depending on what you're working on, this can be a preferred way to work. As long as you don't go super high with the subdivisions, it can actually be a little faster as you're sculpting on things. You'll notice how quickly these strokes are appearing as compared to some of the things you may notice later on when we start to edit the original mesh here, because it is getting a little taxing on the system. But this is actually before dynamic topology was arrived in Blender, this was the only way we had to sculpt. And so this is actually the original method in the software. So if we want to, basically, let's go over these other options. You have subdivide, which we talked about. You've got delete higher, which basically is going to take every single subdivision level that's above the current preview level that you have here. and it's going to get rid of those. So if you decide at some point that you are, let's say you're in object mode and you're scrolling through these preview modes here, and you get up to, you know, level 6 and you go, well, okay, I can see all the detail, but I don't really need all of that detail. I need maybe a level 4. You can say delete higher, and now everything is permanently capped off at that level 4 that you're on. So if you want, you can subdivide again, but you're gonna have lost all of that detail. And this can be useful because of some of the other workflow things we'll get into a little later on. But just understand at this point, delete higher will get rid of anything above your current preview level. So if you've already subdivided higher than this, it'll delete those and cap you at your current preview level. This will let you duplicate the strokes and the sculpts that you've made on a duplicate version of this mesh and copy that over. So if I pull this over to the side and then I start sculpting on this mesh, and let's say I get some other things going on here. So we make some big bold strokes that kind of show the difference here. Then what I can do is jump into object mode and select the mesh here and then click reshape. And it's going to ask me to select second selected mesh object we're required to copy shape from. So we need to right click on this other object and hit reshape. And so actually we're going to do that reverse order. So I'm going to undo that. So let's copy this and right click there. And we'll click reshape. And then there you see that basically it's copied over those strokes from this mesh here. So if you want to, let's say you have a bunch of ideas for how you want to proceed with an object and you want to try out different versions in terms of details, you can copy a bunch of them, pick your favorite one, and then copy those back to your original so that you're not going to mess anything up. And so that's an interesting way to work. And we talked about deleting higher, gets rid of every preview level that is at your max above where your preview is right here. So let's say our max is at 6. We lower the preview down to 4. Delete higher will delete everything above 4. Okay. Apply base works the exact opposite way. So this will take the bottommost level and apply that as your current level. So let's say that we have our current preview at 5. If we hit apply base, that's going to basically turn this into a higher resolution mesh than it was before and apply that. So we might play a little bit with some of these other settings, but basically that's kind of what that works. You've got the same settings here for the subsurf modifier, and then you also have the option here to save your sculpt externally to a file. So that can be handy if you need to reload this back into Blender. But if you get rid of it, you basically are back at your original mesh. And so once again, you're able to kind of dial in what you need, and it's all fluid. So the great thing about the multi-resolution modifier is that you're able to kind of sculpt and make decisions as you go, but it's not locked in. So you're always going to be able to get rid of this modifier and go back to your original mesh, which is, you know, very handy. So let's get in here and play a little bit with the multi-res modifier. Jump into sculpt mode. I'm gonna get my pinch and I'm gonna pinch these sides back up a little bit more. Kind of lost some of that in the way we were subdividing. And I like that this is gonna be a little bit more of a hand sculpted feel here. And the idea here with this workflow is the same as it is with the dynamic topology workflow, in that we're sculpting details that are going to be baked into a texture map that are for a retopologize mesh later on. So whether it's for a video game or in my case, I'm doing this for a 3D illustration that already has a lot of objects in it, and I need to start saving memory on my system so that I can render everything without having to use a render farm and things like that. And even sometimes with a render farm, you know, depending on how big your scene is, this is the way that you need to kind of work. So let's talk a little bit about some of the details we might add into here. Now we're going to go back and add pores on everything. But we need to kind of think about like what we would want to do to kind of give some life to this mesh, because all of these modeled pieces are so clean that they come off as like manufactured, and that's not really what we're going for here. We want these to feel like they were touched by human hands. So let's get in here, and we haven't talked a lot about the clay brush, but this is kind of interesting. It provides a little bit of a way to kind of blob in some things, kind of like clay strips, but it's a little bit more subtle in the way that it works. And what I like to do is switch over to smooth and then make sure my radius and my strength are kind of dialed in. Strength being the more important one in this case, because whenever I hold shift, it's going to use that strength setting for my smooth tool. And so just by adding a little bit of surface variation there, it will make it feel more like it's a little uneven and maybe not so, you know, done by a machine. And if it's too much, again, we can take our flatten tool and kind of bring some of that back, but we don't want to get rid of all of that. And if you can't really tell with your current matte cap while you're sculpting what that's looking like, one of the things you can do is switch this over to something that's got some reflections. And as you rotate in the 3D viewport, and you may need to turn off your fast navigate to see this, but watch how those highlights kind of dance across the top of the surface. And that'll kind of give you some good indications about what your sculpted details are really doing with the surface here. You can see it's really affecting that area where we created all of these sort of wood grains and things like that. And so I'm not going to do much more than this, but that is basically what we're going to do is dial in a little bit of surface variation there. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom because it's just way too perfect. And we might want to even turn this down pretty low. And you can see like how subtle I'm getting here with the way this is working. I mean, that's not much, but it's enough to kind of make you feel like, all right, well, somebody was sanding this down by hand, and you know, obviously it's not perfect. So I'm smoothing this out a little bit because I don't want that perfect seam running along the sides. And you'll find as you get into any kind of modeling or sculpting, especially as you near the latter stages, adding imperfection is really the name of the game because it makes your models feel like they're realistic. It's funny when I talk to photographers and videographers, they go the other way. Everything they do in post is meant to perfect images and make them feel like they're removing chromatic aberration and lens flares, and unless it's on purpose, they want to get rid of noise and all that kind of stuff. And for us, we're struggling to add imperfection back to our stuff because for the most part, it's easy to render a perfect looking material or, you know, whatever. And it's so hard to make it look realistic because in reality, everything's chaotic. You know, there isn't a one set skin shader that is used for a character that can be reused over and over again. Like everybody's skin has different characteristics, and without you manually going in here and tweaking this stuff by hand, it's obvious to anybody watching, you know, your movie, your game, or whatever, that it's not real because they're so used to looking at humans in real life, they can just pick it out immediately. So as a CG artist, you got to start thinking in terms of, how do I add some chaos and some randomness and some natural things to these things here. All right. So we would basically do the same thing to the other fin over here. I'm not going to do it right now because it would be the same way. But before we wrap up, let's subdivide again. And we're just going to add a little bit of scratching here and there. So I'm going to grab my sculpt draw, and then I'm going to lower the strength maybe down to a 0.1. We're going to go real small here, and I'm going to go subtract with my method. And I just want to really subtly get in here and kind of scratch this up. Now, if we can't see that, we need to subdivide again to kind of see if these are showing up. And you'll just have to play with your strength settings and your subdivision levels until you find something that's kind of working. But here you can kind of see these starting to show up here. And again, this is all about wanting to give that sense of, the idea that this little piece, this model was shaped, and it was essentially a solid piece of large material that had to be whittled down into this little thing. And so if it was whittled down, if it hasn't been perfectly sanded, there's going to be little chisel marks and things like that kind of on different areas that have been touched by a knife or things like that. So also remember, like, we're creating something that might be considered an antique in the 3D illustration that we're working on for this month. So if this has been around for quite a long time, there's going to be a lot of people handling this over the years. And so they're going to add their own little scratches and dents and things like that to this object. So it's not going to be much here, but it will show up in the highlights. So remember that these little details like this will show up. And if we switch the matte cap over to a normal matte cap, you can see, depending on how we rotate, that it will pick this up in the texture map. So that's important. Okay, let's jump into some of the things I did up here towards the front where the engine is. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to make this feel like it's joined together as one piece. So before we start sculpting on this, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I am attempting to make this feel like it's connected and is carved out of one giant object here. And the way that I'm doing that is around all of these little edges over here. I'm creating little bitty raised marks and indentations and things like that that show that the mesh over here is kind of raised on these edges where it's joined up for these solid objects. And that just kind of makes it feel like, again, if somebody was getting in there with a knife or something, maybe they couldn't hit every single little nook and cranny. And so it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be perfectly flat. We're going to add a lot of ridges and little things like that here and there. So if I jump out of sculpt mode, we can grab our model over here, and I can kind of try to show you what that looks like a little bit. I'm going to save real fast just in case it goes down. And just in case tonight anything happens and we do go down, I'll come back up pretty much immediately. So you can go back to the YouTube channel and look for the live link to pop back up, because that's where it'll be. And I'll come back up online. So you just have to go look for it if it shuts you out of the window or anything like that. But let's jump into sculpt mode. You'll notice this will go quite a bit slower because we're on the heaviest mesh in the scene here. And let's talk a little bit about how we can kind of fix some of that stuff. So one thing we talked about was decimation. Another thing you can do is if you have other objects floating around the scene, you can just hide those. And so if I turn off this layer, I've separated all my other little pieces onto that layer, and now those are gone, and that saves quite a bit of room because we're now below 2 million polys. So that's one thing you can do. You can also make a mask selection. So if we can jump into our mask tool like this, and we can paint a selection. or if you just use B for box select, you can select all the areas that you're not going to be working on right now for the mesh, and that will create a masked selection of that part of your mesh in sculpt mode. And I'm only focusing on the front here. So everything that's here, I'm going to hide this by going to the hide mask menu, and I'm going to select hide masked right here. You'll notice there's not a keyboard shortcut for that, but now this will speed up quite a bit more because it's not having to render all this other stuff over here. So let's turn back on layer over here so we can see what we're doing. And let's play a little bit with these details. Okay, so we want to pay attention again to our dynamic topology. I like to use the eyedrop tool to kind of pick where I'm working and just dial in what resolution I'm currently at. So this is all at a 126. Let's say we want to bring this up to a 200 at this point. And these are sort of the last level details we're working on here. We're going to select this to add, and we'll start with a strength of 0.1 and kind of see what that looks like. But you can see around these little areas back in here, we want to add in some raised details. So I'm gonna turn these settings up a little bit so you can see what that's doing. But this will make it feel like, okay, well, he couldn't get in here with sandpaper or anything and even this out. And anything you can do to kind of break up the perfect seam that's running through here where it goes through the middle of the sphere, the better you can make it feel realistic. So towards the tips of these, I'm adding in a little bit of a raised ridge around the outside, and that's making it feel like this area sort of came out of this big carved section over here. And it works better from a distance because you're able to actually kind of pick out, you know, the bigger shapes leading into the smaller shapes and stuff like that. But the idea here is to go, again, looking at scale. We've got these big scoops here that kind of maybe show that he started working on it for this other side, but isn't done yet. And then we've got medium level details, which are these little ridges in here. And then if you zoom in, you can see all these little creases and the hard surface details and stuff like that. And eventually we'll have even smaller details than this with the pores and stuff like that that are added in. But I don't want any area of this as it butts up against the side not to kind of be touched. I want this all to have varying height levels of detail. And this is where you get to kind of get in here and be creative with the way this is looking and how these are joining up. And if it is getting a little too weird looking, you can always just go back and smooth this out. But even that kind of changes the surface variation on this side right here and makes it feel a little bit more natural. Just like that. So you can see how perfect this is in here as it starts to butt up against the side of this. And that's going to give it away pretty much immediately that this is something that you modeled hard surface. And the ultimate goal would be, you know, if somebody knows that you're sculpting this or something, that maybe we get in here and do such a good job with these small details that people think that, you know, you took the time to actually sculpt all of these hard surface objects, and that you've got enough control over your sculpture that you're able to pull that off. And you can actually, you know, create a fairly convincing model if you take the time to up the ante with these little bitty details here. So before we crease this up over here, we notice we have a gap between this, which was done at some point, and I'm sure it happened when I was trying to smooth and all that. But we need to add in some more layering to get this back over. So I'm gonna raise my brush size up quite a bit. And then with the sculpt draw tool, it's pretty easy to add in lots of clay and move that pretty quickly. So before I'm too worried about the shape, I just want to add in a bunch of mass over here because we want to build that hill back up on top to where it hits the point of this and joins back up right here. and then we can go back and crease it up. But until then, it's going to be more important that we get the general shape in place. And so don't forget that as you're getting in here to kind of sculpture things. Don't worry about it, how ugly it looks right there. We just want to make sure we're hitting our targets. Now that we've got that, now we can go refine with our pinch and our smooth. So we can zoom out a little bit more, start pinching this up on the sides. Zoom out a lot further. We'll pinch this up even more here. And there you go. You want to keep a pretty smooth, steady hand as you're pinching so that that line stays fairly straight. And of course, we'll spend more time towards the end going back and making sure we have final passes of pinching and all sorts of stuff. But you don't want to smooth everything. That's one of the things that's kind of hard to remember as you're learning. You want to leave some areas that are rough, because eventually we're going to smooth shade this whole thing, and the rough areas are going to maintain a little bit of character. So I don't want to just get rid of all of these details that we've taken the time to add in here. There you go. You see how that feels a lot more like, all right, well, somebody carved that out of there. And it's just, again, it's a game of give and take. You know, you have to kind of play with this until it's doing what you need it to do for you. So does anybody have any questions about anything we've talked about either tonight or in the other streams that you would like me to talk about? Okay, so it doesn't take long to do this, but you want to make it a little different for each of these scoops. And you'll notice too that I went in and for each of these scoops, I kind of filled in the scoop with one solid plane in the middle. And in fact, let's talk a little bit about how I built this real fast, because I know some of you are interested in kind of how that's working. So let me jump out of sculpt mode really quickly. Always take an opportunity to save whenever I can, but let's just jump over to this layer and take a look at this. So building this was not super complex, but there's a bit of a setup to it. So I'm gonna hide all of this stuff right here, so we can just talk about this, this section here. So if we look at basically one of these little scoops here, and I turn off these objects, what we basically have is one subdivision surface model that has been hard surface modeled like this. And then I added a subsurf modifier to smooth all the edges out, and just beveled edges like we've talked about in the past. And you know, just try to get something that was pretty close to concept art. So if we pull that up, you can kind of see these are a little bit more rounded, but in the end, I think, you know, this is pretty close. And so after that, I had just this all modeled on the inside and everything, but I started thinking about the idea of the pipe and how was somebody supposed to get, you know, all of these done to where the inside of these are all showing with all of these scoops. And I thought, well, that's a little unrealistic because nobody could get back in here. no matter what kind of tools they had at that scale, and kind of scoop that stuff out. So I decided to just add in a basic plane for this object. And then what I did to create the these kind of rotated around an object was I created a sphere here. This is parented to, or actually it's not parented. It's using the sphere as an object offset. So if we add an array modifier here, an array modifier basically is just going to take any object that you have, and if you add an array modifier, it's just going to just duplicate that. So you can pick how many copies you want, and then there's options for how to control that number, but basically you can pick how many copies you want and then choose how to move them around the scene. So this will control the distance and different axes. So you can really kind of pick how you want to offset these here, or you can use another object as an offset. And so that's what I did here. Basically, I picked this little icosphere, and then when I told it I wanted 8 copies, using the icosphere as an offset, if I jump into my rotation here for the icosphere, you can see it's at 48 degrees on the y-axis. And so by rotating the sphere, I'm controlling how far apart those are gapped around a circle here. And so I just kind of dialed this into something that I thought was, fairly close to being 360 degrees with 8 copies. And you can be a lot more accurate with that, if you do the division and all of that, but that's how you would do that. I use this for a lot of stuff. I use this for, in my course on how to do a car, I talk about how to do hubcaps this way, because doing hubcaps or rims are very complex hard surface models in the sense that they have patterns and things. And so to create something that's that symmetrical, that has that many different variations of curves and things, this is the best way to kind of do this. And in this case, it actually helps. So what I'll do is basically, I keep everything here for reference. And then after I'm done sculpting all this, I'll go in and delete the extra copies inside of the mesh that I don't need. And I'm just waiting until I'm done with the rest of this to do that. I did this exact same method for all of these little spokes that go around the inside of this turbine or whatever this is. And there's just a lot more of them. So, but I created an empty, and yeah, this is controlling the rotation there. And the rest of these are just basic objects that I modified. So this is a torus object that I added and then deleted half of it, and then I just added some bevels and extrusions and things like that. So not super complicated, but it does the job. So the torus is just a default mesh. So if you go under mesh here, you can select torus, and it's basically just a donut shape here. And then you've got options down here if you want to kind of play with the segments, or you can even do rotations and all sorts of weird stuff. So it's kind of cool. But that was pretty simple. Same thing for this down here. I basically created a circle and then extruded that with a little bit of a bevel using our proportional editing here to curve this out a little bit. And these are just cylinders basically, and shape those back into the side of the ship here. So yeah. All right, let's jump in here and see about some other details. So one of the things we talked about from the concept art was kind of combining all 3 of these into this final design. And so most of these pieces are now in place. I still haven't decided whether I'm going to add this piece here into the ship and how that's going to fit onto the front end, but we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we talked about liking these little round portholes, or on a real submarine, these would probably be like torpedo bays. But that and then some of these wires and things were kind of interesting. So possibly adding those. And then I like the barnacles, but that's more of a last minute detail, like the pores are for the sepia light material. So again, we have to decide kind of what our priority is, what order we want to get stuff done in. And at this point, we also need to decide what we want to sculpt and what we want to model, because these would probably be something I would model because they're a little bit more precise. And actually, we could probably just take this as a starting point and kind of play with this. So I might select this piece here. And let's duplicate this out to the side and separate this out into a separate mesh. And then I'm going to get rid of some of these pieces that are just going to be easier to rebuild. And so this is basically just a skewed circle that we have here. And so if I use Control Shift Alt S, I can unskew this back to where it's relatively vertical again. And then I'm just going to select two of these edge loops here. Let's make sure we get the right ones. I'm going to hit E to extrude these back into space on the Y axis. So we basically just have a little ring here for our porthole. And let's start with that and get this into place. So reposition the origin to the middle of our geometry. Rotate that so that it's flat. And let's see how we might put these in place. So these are going to be curved, kind of matching the angular side of this port, or this hole over here. So we just need to kind of line that up and then kind of eyeball this into place. And as long as we get kind of close, we'll be all right. Okay. And then from here, I'm going to go into local mode and let's talk about what we want to do for the details here. So I know that I want to fill in the middle here, but I want that to be a separate object. So let's just grab this inner circle and duplicate that and scale it in a little bit. I might extrude that in a bit more. And then let's fill this hole. So we just have a basic cap. Now the normals are flipped, and I can tell because this is it's looking a little weird that it's a darker shade. So we need to select this and then flip the normals with Control N or Control Shift N if it's not going the right direction. And now you can see how that coloring is pretty much the same across both objects, which tells me that the lighting is consistent. Okay, so now let's pull this in. And you'll notice we need to reset our smooth shading because we've been modeling, you know, some things in here that weren't there before. And so by default, it flat shades all of the stuff. So we need to select smooth shade, and that will preview that for us. Now I do want to add a little bit of a bevel, but I don't want to add a lot because I like the way this is sort of inset and rounded off in terms of this door, whatever this is. So I'm going to select this outer edge, Control B for bevel, and then I'm gonna create a pretty wide bevel here. You can see how big that is. So it's not gonna give us a sharp corner, but it will kind of fill in the sides here for us. Okay, and then what I might do is grab these faces and pull them out a little bit more, like this. Okay, and then one more time, I'm gonna grab this outside edge. I'm gonna bevel this again, but we're gonna add in, again, a pretty big distance there. And then I might scale this out just a little bit. There we go. Okay, what do we need to do to make this a little bit more interesting? Well, let's see. First of all, we need to scale this up a little bit so that those gaps are filled in the side, so you can't rotate and look through it anyway. So that's good. You can play with selecting these faces in the middle and maybe extruding them in. This is where you get to kind of play around and come up with something interesting for the design. Bevel this a little bit. Might select all of these. I for insets. We could extrude those out just a little bit. If we want to harden those edges up on the side, we just add a loop cut in, going all the way through, and pull that up closer to these other edges to create a sharp edge there. If we're not happy with the way that this is pinching in the corner, we're going to deselect all of these edges in through here. And I'm gonna slide those away. So double tap G to edge slide those. And at this point, I start to notice, well, okay, I'm doing a lot of work that I don't need to do because I could just use a mirror modifier because I'm doing everything twice now. So what I will probably do at this point is jump into vertex mode. Let's delete half of this, and then let's add in a mirror modifier. Put it above the subsurf so that everything merges and connects before we subdivide. And there we go. So now we just need to play with what everything's looking like and decide if we're happy with kind of what's going on with the design. Okay, I don't like how this is not rounded off in the inside right here. So in order to fix that, we're gonna have to smooth these out a little bit and kind of pull them apart from each other. So I'm just double tapping G in vertex mode to edge slide those. And again, with the mirror modifier turned on, we don't have to worry about but one side of this at a time. And that really helps kind of speed things up and make sure that everything's consistent and symmetrical, and all of that stuff. So okay. And you can just kind of keep doing this, well, infinitely until you've created something you're kind of happy with. This is probably the fastest way to creatively model using this technique with hard surfaces without using a plugin. If you want to get into hard surface modeling, I highly recommend checking out HardOps because it's complicated to learn and use, but it's so much faster than doing traditional subsurf modeling. You don't have to worry about topology as much, and yeah, it's about as revolutionary as sculpting when you first learn it, in my opinion. So I'm going to be doing a whole course on it at some point, but not in the near future. So all right, so something else happened up here that I'm not super thrilled about. I also noticed that we're still doing twice as much work because we've got something that can pretty much be subdivided again and cut in half again. And so if we want to, we can delete another quarter of this and just do this top half. So you're gonna have to pick an edge that's symmetrical down the middle to do this, but then you would just basically re-enable symmetry on, in this case, it would be the Z-axis or the Y-axis, one of those two. And that's how you would do that. But in this case, since I'm at a weird angle, I'm not gonna do that. And then by differing the widths of all of these edges in terms of how close these edges are bunched up against each other in these rows for these loops, you can kind of add in some interesting variation. So the further I slide these edges out from the side right here, the smoother this edge will become on this corner, but it will stay sharp on the tops and bottoms here. So let me play with this a little more and you'll see what I'm saying. So now we have sort of a smoother bevel there. And if we're not happy with that, we can always bring that in. So there we go. So the first thing we need to decide is kind of scale and how we're going to place these on the side. We can use a array modifier like we talked about before. One of the easiest things to do, however, would be to take what we have and then use Alt-D to copy a duplicate linked version off the side. And then once we do that once, we can hit Shift-R several times, and it will repeat the last operation that we did. Now in this case, we haven't accounted for the angling off of the ship there. So that's not really gonna be something that's gonna easily line this up for us, help us out, but that is an option. So one of the things we might do is rotate into an angle that gives us sort of a top-down view along the side of this wall. And start from here and see if we can get it to work. Yeah, a little better, but I'm just gonna place these by hand. And you'll notice as we model, you know, the hard surface pieces and different elements to the submarine here, that the areas that you think are straight on the side are really going to show up as wobbly if they're not lined up correctly. So that's something you need to kind of be aware of, because we know since these are perfectly round and lined up at a specific angle, this whole side should kind of be at that same angle, at least theoretically. And if we notice that there's a lot of difference and variations in height and things like that, then we need to kind of pay attention to that and decide if we need to spend some more time working on the ship to sculpt it into something that'll work here. So what we might do on the other side to keep the theme sort of headed in the same direction is, we know that the side needs to be relatively flat to accommodate these pieces. Over here we have somewhat of a ridge that's kind of running through that we need to flatten out. So let's jump into sculpt mode and take care of that really quickly. And then I'll do a simpler variation of those little doors or whatever on the other side. So you'll notice that part of the mesh is still hidden because of what we did before. So we need to unhide that by clicking show all. And then what I'm going to do is the mask will still be active. So if we just invert the mask with Control I, that will flip the selection to the front side so it's masked off. And then we can hide that so that we can work on this part of it. Okay. So I'm going to grab our flatten here. Let's make sure our dynamic topology is, we'll just turn it off for this case. We don't really need any more detail, so we'll just leave the detail as it is. And we'll flatten this down. One of the things we want to make sure we're not turning on is symmetry at this point, because both sides are very different. And I've made the mistake of keeping that on. And yeah, that's not good. Okay, so we'll just smooth out one section here so it's a little bit more flat. And then we'll jump back in and grab our objects over here. Now we want to create a separate copy that's not linked because these are going to be a little different. And so what I'll do is I'll hit Shift D, and I'm going to reposition my cursor in the middle of the viewport here. And I'm going to apply scale and rotation. So this is all back to kind of 1. Let's reposition the origin back to the 3D cursor, so it's over here. And then I'm just gonna move this, scale it by -1 in the y-axis. So that'll effectively copy a mirrored version of this straight over to this side for me. So now what I want to do is reposition the origin, because we still want to use the mirror modifier here. And actually, before we do this, let's go ahead and apply this. So let's duplicate this, hit escape to keep it where it is. I'm going to apply the mirror modifier. I'm going to get rid of the subsurf. Let's reposition the origin around the 3D cursor. Apply the rotation and scale. Scale it by -1 on the y-axis, so that it's in the same place on the other side. And then we can decide how we want to play with this. So the very center of the object, we will center the cursor around this ring here. We will reposition this around the cursor. And now what I can do is, again, delete half of this. Okay, let's add our mirror modifier back. Let's apply the scale. Okay. This is doing some weird stuff with the way this is working. And that's because we did the mirror modifier before we rotated this into place. So I'm going to undo this until we have the original back in place. Little things you gotta think about as you go. Okay, so now what I wanna do is I wanna simplify this a little bit so that we're not keeping the exact same level of details we have over here. I want this to be a little bit more simplified. So what I kind of did here was I just left this without a subdivision modifier. But in this case, it's still a little too much detail for my taste. So let's rotate this into place a little bit. And I just basically want a cylinder that is sort of simplified down to its original, version. So I'm gonna grab this and we'll select everything in the middle, hide it, and then I want to get rid of these edge loops. So I'm gonna hit X and delete these edge loops that are creating this bevel. So we're kind of back to the original cylinder here. Let's unhide the rest of this and work on this now. And this won't be quite as easy, but we could do the same thing here. We just select these areas that are edge loops all the way around, X, and delete those. You gotta be careful sometimes the way you do this because on a more complex mesh like this, it doesn't always know how to simplify and recorrect. So you want to do this in areas that are pretty obvious that the edge loops are being inserted the way that they are. So these top to bottom ones are fairly simple. That should work on both sides. And then let's see if we can find one that runs all the way through. Delete that one. We know we're going to want to get rid of these and simplify this down. So let's just hit Control plus to add to this selection until we get back to this and delete those. Join these back up. So those are solid faces. So now we're back to a pretty simplified version of that. We don't want to inset any of this stuff, so we want to re-simplify the way this is kind of working. Let's delete these. Let me just merge these vertices at the center. So this is more of what you'd see me doing if I was doing a lot more, what I traditionally do for modeling and things like that. I tend to think through the process a little bit more, so I don't have to do this sort of stuff. But we're kind of going off the cuff here, so you're going to see how I would typically get in here and kind of work on some of this. All right, we also want to get rid of this section. Let's hit Control plus and just grow this until we get rid of everything extra. This is all not necessary. Okay, so we're gonna get rid of these middle faces. And then I want to join this back up over here. There's a little button here in the bottom you can turn on if you want to do this automatically. And this will automatically merge the vertices as they snap to each other. So if we check this off, and then we have this set to vertex snapping, if I start moving and I hold control, it will snap this vertex and then automatically merge those, as you can see. So if you're doing a lot of this, that can be a handy way to kind of quickly merge without having to use the merge command. And then eventually you'll get back to a point where you have all of these and you can just join those back up like that. So if we were to add a subsurf modifier, we're kind of back to the simplified version of what we had over here. One of the things I noticed was that we did lose one too many bevels on these, because I do want to add sort of a bevel here, but we'll keep that pretty simplified. I don't even think I want this inset, so let's get rid of this too. And yeah, let's just make this easier. Join this back up with a solid face in the middle. Okay, so now we've got a simplified version on this side and a complex version on this side. And it's just, again, kind of going with the theme that we've created for how this is working. So we got 5. So let's kind of pick an angle here. And again, I'm going to use Alt-D. Try to pick the same sort of skip distances here. Get those kind of lined up a little bit. And then we're going to have to like hand place these a little bit so that they're in a better position. Okay, save. All right, not bad. So do we want to add these cables? Might be an interesting way to show you guys a way to do that quickly with curves. But I'm not really sure if they fit with what I want to do here. Okay. So one of the things we can do once we have these kind of in place, if we're not happy with the way this is working, is leave these where they are and then just use sculpt mode to kind of get things dialed back in on the mesh. So I'll lower the strength a little bit. And then we can play with kind of leveling off this area here. Raise this up a little bit. I'm going to add one of these clay strips back in so that this is all sort of on the same level here. And then I'm just going to gently massage this back into place. So let's grab our inflate and deflate. And I want to deflate this a little bit because you can see it's going through the middle of this area. So let's pull this in a little bit here. We'll go back and smooth. And then let's see how this is all lining up here. Yeah, it's a little better. We need to add a little bit more on this end. So that's connecting kind of the way we want it to there. And then once again, we'll smooth. Okay. So I think that's good. Okay, and if we need to dial back in that crease, we're gonna just quickly set this up, grab our smooth stroke, lower the size back down, drag this back out over here. Just like that. Okay. So there's that. All right, let's get back into doing a little bit more detailing on these other pieces. And wrap up a little bit. Okay, so same thing here. I want to add a multi-res. We'll add 3 or 4 subdivisions. And then this one, I'm just going to add the little bitty scratches to the surface. Let's jump into sculpt mode. Use the sculpt draw and take the strength down a little bit. I want the size to be pretty low here. And obviously, the more time you can give a little bit of thought to how you're adding these in terms of how maybe something got scuffed up, the more realistic that's going to come off. One of the big things you don't want to do as you're getting in here and adding these surface level details using the multi-res modifier, because of the workflow and the way that it's going to be used later, is you don't want to drastically change the shape of the surface. So you'll notice I only did the wood grain, light enough that it didn't change the silhouette at all of the stem here. And that's really important because as you go into retopologize this mesh later on, typically the way you would work with a multi-res is that you would have the low-res mesh duplicated off to the side and then saved the base resolution, so that you don't have to go retopologize. You've already got that mesh saved out. And then basically once you do the surface level details on your mesh, you can just take the high res mesh and bake the mesh that you already modeled as the low res mesh. That only works though if you haven't really changed the silhouette of your high res sculpt mesh. So Lauren says, I think that scratches should occur mostly in the direction in which the submarine travels. So yes, if the submarine was moving, but in this case, I'm thinking about it from the sense that it's a pipe that people are handling and somebody was sculpting this. And so that's kind of my motivation for how I'm adding these in. And yeah, I'm not taking it super seriously, in the sense that we're trying to recreate a sub that's lifelike. It's stylized, so we want to make sure we keep that in mind as we get in here and play with this. But yes, if we were going to do a realistic submarine, the the rust and everything would be, going with the waves that are hitting it this way. So there we go. Let's do the same thing to our mesh down here. So I think for most of these, 3 or 4 is probably good. We're getting a little bit more faces than we had before, but that's okay because it's not, it's not up to 6 million like it was earlier today. So that's good. Okay, now on this object, you're going to notice too with the multi-res, there's a little bit of different characteristics in the way that your strokes work on these meshes, and that's because it has to follow the topology of your underlying mesh. So you're not adding resolution with each stroke like you are with dynamic topology. And so as I try to add in these scratches, it's going to be a little easier, you'll notice, to add in scratches that follow these edge loops around like this. If I try to cut across in a weird direction, you can see I'm going up and down right now. These aren't really showing up all that well. And the reason that those aren't showing up as well is because it's having to cut across geometry that where the edges don't line up. And so you don't have that problem when you're using dynamic topology because it basically continuously subdivides and subdivides and subdivides until you have triangles everywhere. And so it's so small that, again, if I zoom in here, you'll see what it's doing. There's no pattern. There's no way to kind of recognize what's going on. It's just continuously creating more as it needs to, whereas that's not happening with multi-res. So the problem you're going to run into is, again, you have to kind of follow and at least be aware of the resolution limitations of where you're currently at. And if you're noticing that you can't really add the directional strokes that you want, you can subdivide again and it'll help, but it's never going to be as good as dynamic topology, which is kind of why I stick with that most of the time. So in this case, again, rounding off this sort of surface, if you were going to carve this, especially back in the 1800s or something like that, would not be an easy task. And this material obviously is going to have, its own little characteristics to it in terms of how brittle it is and things like that. And so that's something else to consider as you're getting in here and adding these sculpted imperfections, is like, maybe it isn't just about scratches all the time. Like, you need to add, chips. And of course we're talking about a texture level detail here. And so this is just one aspect of the texture. We're talking about the bumpiness and the roughness of the surface. There's a lot of other aspects in the material that can be touched by your hand in terms of hand painting and things like that. And one of the things you might think about is, if this was going to be painted or something, if you're going to be chipping away material, there's going to be different layers of material that are exposed. And so part of this might be, have the paint still visible, where you've got a painted on pattern or a color or whatever, whether it's wood or metal or whatever you're doing. And then underneath that, you're going to have more rust or worn edges or things like that. And so that's where you start to dial in, what has this object kind of been through in terms of its lifespan? What adventures has it touched? Because all of those little things in terms of how it looks now are basically telling you what it's been through. And so if these edges are perfectly clean, there's no chips, there's no anything like that, we know that it's probably brand new. And if that's not something that's obvious from the viewer's perspective, that you did that on purpose, they're going to just assume that it is brand new, or that you didn't take the time to add in those details that were necessary. And as such, if you're trying to make something look aged and then you forget to do something like weather the edges of your whole model, it's going to come off as lazy, and it's going to come off as something to the audience that breaks that illusion of making them feel like they're there experiencing with you, whatever you're doing there. So these edges, if it is made out of some material, it is, hundreds of years old at this point, we need to play around with chipping these edges a little bit. And so let's look at how we might do that. Yeah, so that's a good point. Like the smoker in this point, if he was using this, like let's assume he's using this on a regular basis, it's not decorative, they're not going to just put it on a shelf. There's a little tamping tool that's made out of metal that you would use to tamp down your tobacco, and you're going to scratch up the edges of your bowl here as you're trying to tamp that down. So there's also going to be soot and all sorts of stuff on the inside of this if it's been used. And again, that's where we have to decide, is this something that is going to be in our illustration? Is it going to be lit? Is there going to be smoke coming out of it? Or is it going to be behind a glass case sitting on someone's mantle as, their antique find of the century? But in this case, we definitely know that this wasn't made yesterday. So these edges are way too perfect. So let's dent these up a little bit. Now I don't know if this is actually joined. So let me grab this real fast and make sure. Okay, yeah, that's one object. So we should be able to dent this up. So I'm gonna raise my strength here a little bit. And again, you'll notice this wants to follow the topology that's running sideways. There's a lot more edges running around this ring than there are running vertically. And so as I try to chip this up, even with 4 or 5 subdivisions here, trying to go vertically, it doesn't really want to let me until I find a vertical edge. And again, that's just a limitation of using the multi-res workflow. So it is possible to use this to great effect, but again, you're going to need to know the limitations a little bit. So there we've got a little bit more damage. Might smooth this a little bit, this side, just to look a certain way or whatever. But, and of course, like everything, you don't want to go overboard, but just enough to make it feel like, all right, well, something happened there, And the hard part when you're doing this part of it is not repeating the same details like everywhere, because you'll get in here and you'll want to just go nuts because it's a lot of fun playing with these details, but you want a lot of variation in the way that these are looking. And so for this area right here, I'm trying to create a little bit more of a dent. And so that's something that the viewer is immediately going to see, just like a mole or a wart or freckle or on somebody's face. They're going to see that and go, okay, well, something happened there. And I don't see that repeated over here. And as a CG artist, that's the first thing I start to look for when I see a really good model. Is I go, all right, what are the unique identifying features with the textures and the shaders and things like that? How much time did they put in on things like this? Because the more they've created, that illusion where there's nothing symmetrical. I can't tell where the seams are in a texture. I can't tell where they got lazy and they decided not to do, reflections on something or, whatever they're doing. If I can't tell, that's a good sign. That means that they spent a lot of time thinking that through and knew that that's going to jar someone out of the experience, right? And, you may not think people notice, but I can tell you for sure that if I'm sitting here looking at a still image, it's very important. It's less important if there's a lot of things moving on the screen in video games and things like that. But there, it's about the complexity and about the interaction and that side of it. And it's about saying, well, how much effort do they put into doing the magical effects, the smoke and the particles and all that stuff? And again, if it's just a couple of things that seem lazy, the player picks up on that and it affects the gameplay. So all that matters. So we need to just kind of be thinking about ways to kind of play with things and make them a little unique here. So one of the cool things here that these tools do is give you the option to do some things we don't normally do. So twist is a good example of something that's kind of fun to play with. So this, you just drag, and it allows you to kind of twist and turn sections of your mesh. So back here, if we want to play with that, you know, that's kind of fun. Same thing with nudge. If you doing this, you can kind of, this is sort of like what smudge does in Photoshop. So it's kind of a fun tool. This just lets you kind of stretch and play with things a little bit. Now again, here, we're actually screwing up the topology. So again, you want to be aware of what you're doing. You don't want to drastically affect the silhouette. This stuff isn't really going to matter because it'll just show up as a bumpy surface. But we're getting close to that edge of where from a certain angle, you might be able to see a silhouette change, and that's not going to be good. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's play a little bit more with some of these scratches on the surface. And maybe a little strong. Dial that back a little bit. And so another way to kind of change this up is, again, scale. So I want big marks in some areas. I want smaller marks as you zoom in. I want there to be maybe a 1, 2, 3 read. We talk about that a lot in art in terms of importance for the viewer to have 3 levels of read in your whatever you're creating. So they should be able to, from a distance, see, you know, 1 level of detail. As they get closer, they should see a medium and mid-range of detail, and then as they, you know, stand a foot away from it, they should be able to tell a lot of minute detail and key areas that you've picked out to add that into. And that just, again, it shows that your world has depth and dimension, that you've thought this through, that no matter how far a viewer wants to go into your imaginary world, that you have thought far enough ahead to lead them into that world, and that you got their back. You know, they can trust you because you're not going to drop the ball in the sense that the illusion is broken after they get so far into it that they're like, oh, well, okay. That's where it starts to get pixelated. That's where it starts to feel like the artist is, you know, they didn't have enough time to meet the resolution demands, or, you know, that's not really high def, or, you know, whatever it is. But so anyways, again, you'll see me here like struggling to come up with stuff to do with the way that this multi-res is working, because it's easy to make streaks and stuff like that, but to vary this up, it's kind of difficult to come up with unique ideas for texturing on the bump level. Painting this, we could do a lot of stuff, but, you know, again, right now we're just playing with the bumpiness of the surface. But I love this part of the process because there's not really any stress with this part of the process. All this stuff you can kind of, it's fluid and flexible, and you can play with, you know, undoing it if you're not happy with it or whatever. So like right here, I can go in and smooth a lot of this out if I want to take it back. And that's one of the big things about sculpting that is really kind of freeing and liberating, is you've got this ability to kind of just massage away all the mistakes if you're not happy with something. Hey Max, what's up? Good to see you. Glad you're part of the stream. We got about 20 minutes left in tonight, but I will be back tomorrow night talking about Blender 2.8 and the new features. So glad you could make it for the last part of the stream tonight. We were talking about sculpting details on this hand sculpted pipe that we're working on here in Blender. Right now, I'm trying to make this look a little bit weathered and beat up and stuff like this. So One of the things to bear in mind too is we need to go back and do the pores and all that sort of stuff. So we don't want to make this look also like the wood over here too much. So we need to kind of sculpt this in a way that's going to be a little bit in between, where it's got scratches but not wood grain, right? So let's smooth some of this back out. We'll leave the heaviest dents and scars and stuff like that there, but a lot of this we want to just be a little bit more subtle in this. But this is enough that the highlights will catch some of this no matter what material we throw on this. And, you know, so that's kind of the point of this, is we didn't just create a really smooth, you know, hard surface model that is perfect. We're beating this up. So there we go. If you see any areas that are just drastically perfect, you want to, you know, mess them up a little bit. So this one I'll smooth out in terms of that edge and beat it up. This might be a good chance to add in another one of those like bigger dents over here. It's a little different than the rest of the mesh. Sorry, Max, I don't speak Russian, but I hope that you can still get some cool stuff out of this. All right, one quick look to see, make sure we're not still looking too clean. And then the last thing I'll do is beat up some more of this down here before we're done with this piece. I am from the USA, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Where are you from? The other thing is, like, we're not limited to using multi-res. We can play with the dynamic topology if we want to go in and add in some more unique stuff. The only downside is, typically when you strap into using multi-res, you're going to want to utilize your low-res mesh as your retopoed object. And so again, you guys just have to remember, don't change the silhouette, because you're gonna wreck that plan if that's what you're trying to do. Oh, cool, Max, you're from Russia. That's awesome, man. What time is it there? So Lorian is asking, why aren't the data, the number of vertices, faces changing as you sculpt? Do they only change when you save or render? So that's a good question. So this has to do with the fact that we're using the multi-res modifier instead of dynamic topology. So multi-res will lock in the resolution as you subdivide manually, clicking this button here. And so, yeah, you won't notice any of this stuff changing because we're not changing the number of vertices as we sculpt. We're just changing the way that they're laid out, and they're bumping in and out with the sculpting. Now, dynamic topology, because as its name implies, is dynamic, you were actually going to be constantly adding and removing topology and faces as you sculpt. And so that's the big difference between these two workflows. The benefit here is, again, you can see me just blazing through adding details quickly without having to have my computer calculate what's going on and slow down and all that sort of stuff. And that's, again, because we're locking in Blender, not having to calculate that stuff on the fly. And that's one of the biggest benefits of this workflow is that. But the flexibility is also kind of not as great. So, all right, so let's call that good. Jump back into object mode. And I got about 15 minutes. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and start adding in some of those other details again for the pores, and kind of touching up some of these areas that I'm pretty sure are going to be done at this point. And remember that this needs to sort of be the last step, because we're going to move on to adding in the octopus and other objects like that. I'm not sure if I'm going to add all of that into a stream, because tomorrow we're not going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the new features in Blender, but I don't know. If you guys want to see it in the Orange Guild, let me know, and I'll do a private stream just for guild members, and we'll do that. But only if you guys want to see it. So. Okay. Let's jump into sculpt mode real fast on this main mesh. I'm going to unhide all of it and clear the mask. Let's turn off this layer so that we're just looking at this mesh. And let's play with our pores. So yes, the question is, can we simulate smoke in Blender if we want to create a smoking pipe in the final scene? And the answer is yes, we can. It's fairly complex and something we'll need to spend some time discussing in full detail. So maybe I'll do an entire week of simulations, and we can talk about how to do smoke and fire and all sorts of stuff like that. But yes, it's definitely possible. All right, I'm gonna use Sculpt Draw. We need to open up our texture menu down here. I need to add a new texture. Call this Pores. Let's jump over to our texture tab. Open up our Pores alpha here. So we want to set this to view plane. I'm going to set the method to airbrush, lower the rate pretty low. And then we want to make sure that the strength is down pretty low as well. Raise the size of this here. I'm going to start on this side, make sure that symmetry is turned off. Dynamic topology should be turned on for this. And, you know, we can try it without it at first and see how it looks, but I think we're going to need to turn it on. If we keep it off, it'll actually be really, really good because it'll save us quite a bit of memory. We're already at about 2 million polys here, so yes, so it's a little harsh. We need to turn the strength down, and also the resolution's not high enough here, so we definitely need to turn on the dynamic topology. And I noticed that for final details like this on this sort of mesh, we need to sort of sample the highest level of detail we already have and then kind of go from there. So the top of this resolution right here we have is about 700. And so I'm going to say 600 is probably a decent number to dial in these right here. Now you'll notice again, we're already super dense here. And so we need to pay attention to what this is doing and not go overboard. But let's start with 3 and see if that's enough. Lower the strength to 0.05. Okay, so even this is not dense enough to get all that detail in there. Now, it might be if we turn on our smooth shading. So let's check that off and see with the smooth shading turned on if the resolution is enough to keep that going. But I'm not sure that it will be. This will take a minute to calculate. Yeah, so you can see there that even with smooth shading turned on, we're losing a lot of that that poor detail, and it's kind of fuzzy. So I'm gonna undo that. So I could possibly decimate some more on the mesh before we get to this level. The problem is that at this point, we've already decimated most of what we need to, because I did that just before we got into the stream tonight. And even that only got us down to about 1,000,005. So at some point, we're just going to have to add this detail back, because even if we decimate all this back down, if I still have to up the resolution back to 600 to get this finer detail back in here, and we're going to cover this on the whole mesh, then we've still got the same problem. Now, one of the ways around this, because we do know that we kind of want to apply this over the whole thing, is that we don't actually have to sculpt this in. If we instead want to use a shader and cycles to accomplish this with a displacement map or custom bump there, we could do that, and it will save you from having to do the sculpting step and adding in tens of millions of polys and all this stuff. But it's harder to customize, and again, there's trade-offs. So it really just depends on what you want to do. In this particular case, I'm going to give it a shot, and we'll see kind of what happens. You can see how slow that's going when it adds those polys, and then again, you'll see this climb pretty quickly. But that is definitely the resolution we kind of need to be at here. So let's play with putting the strength back at 1. The rate, you put down to 0.02. Kind of dust this in a little bit here. And again, as you are maintaining your brush size at a constant level, zooming in and out will create bigger and smaller pores. So you just kind of need to feel this out and decide for yourself like what resolution with your texture map is the best to use. So I like the way that's kind of going in, but I do think that it's pretty strong and heavy-handed. So I'm not going to do this on the whole thing. I'm just going to pick out key areas that need to have some very strong definition of these pores, and then we'll dust in another lighter variation over the whole thing. And again, that goes back to just adding in layers of detail and depth, because you want to kind of vary this up. Now, this is all kind of being sprinkled in from the same direction. So if you want, you can vary this angle up here and kind of play with how that's being utilized there. If you instead want to be able to see what you're doing as you are putting this in, you can grab a stencil. And then we talked about this before. Right click and drag will let you reposition this. Control and right click and drag will let you rotate this, and then shift and right click and drag will let you kind of reposition how this looks. So this is good because it lets you kind of preview what this is going to look like before you put this on your mesh here. And then you just use this as sort of, again, like a spray paint stencil to kind of dab this in. And then if we move this over, you can see how that looks. So let's talk about rate a little bit in terms of the airbrush stroke method. So this is going to change. Rate is specific just to airbrush. So typically this is on space, and spacing is the same here as it is in Photoshop on a brush setting. That's basically how far apart your strokes distance are when they connect as you drag your pen across the screen. And so the higher you space things out, the more scattered things will look, and the closer you space things together, the more continuous your line will be. And so if we switch this to airbrush, the rate is basically like, think of this as about how much of the paint is coming out of your spray paint can when you are spraying this on the mesh. So taking the rate down to something really, really low is going to, even with the strength turned up higher over here for your tool, if we look at the strength, it's at 0.1. Even with that turned up, if the rate is down lower, it's not going to make tons of paint come out right there. But if we crank the rate up, so let's pull this up to a 0.5, which is sort of halfway in between. Now, if I start painting with the same strength setting, you're going to notice more of that happening. And this is easier to tell if we're not using a stencil. So let's switch this back to view plane. And now if I just click and drag, you'll see, like, if I leave the pin in the same place, this is going to start stacking up lots and lots of quote unquote paint in terms of airbrushing. So if I undo that, and instead I scroll down here and I turn my rate back down to like a 0.01, you're not going to see that anymore. So let me like Blender catch back up real fast. Come on. Okay, so let's save. Always like to do that right before or right after I avoid a crash. It's always good. But you can see we're already up to almost 4 million polys at this point, and that's just from adding in these little details on the side. So we're gonna have to be careful about what we're doing here. And in fact, this may not work out to be a great plan. So we may have to do kind of what Lauren was suggesting and decimate and I don't know how we would handle that. Create a separate mesh that has a lot less detail and just copy the poor data over to the new mesh. Maybe that would work. Not entirely sure. I'll play with it. I'll get back with you guys on what works. Yeah, this is what happens when you start messing with meshes that have tons and tons of polys. Like, Blender slows down to a crawl, saving takes 10 minutes, you know. Yeah, it gets frustrating. Okay, so now if we take our rate back down to something really low and we were to drag this down, you can see there's like barely anything happening, and it's harder to get more on the mesh here. So that rate controls what's going on there in terms of how quickly you're throwing that texture down into the mesh. So Lauren's asking, since the side of the pipe that we're working on right now is supposed to be rough and unfinished, doesn't the multi-res mode look good enough for over here? And so I'm not so concerned about the fact that the side is unfinished and that there needs to be less detail. The idea that it's unfinished means that there's not going to be as many manual creases and things that we're detailing in by hand over here. But to the human eye, as we render, if we're going to do multiple angles of this or whatever, and I kind of want to plan for that, because even though we may only render from this side, you want to be able to do a 360 for your portfolio or whatever. You need to still be able to make this side look as high resolution and as photorealistic as possible. And so even though it's going to be smoother in terms of the mineral that we're recreating, you're still going to see these pores, and these pores are only possible by creating a lot more resolution as we're doing here, or again, by creating a separate cycles material to render from. Okay, so before I close out tonight, I want to kind of show you a little bit of a setup that I created for the pipe in terms of how I've been doing preview renders. So I'm going to switch back into object mode and quickly go over this before I close out. So I think there might be something valuable here for you guys. So you don't actually have to get all the way through the process of retopologizing and stuff like that before you start actually showing off your models. And so what I've done here is I've taken the high-res sculpture and everything here. We're almost 5 million faces, so quite a bit of geometry. But in object mode, you can see we can still get around fairly well. And so what I've done is I've set up some separate little scene setups so that I can do some different angle renders of this. And we were talking last week about some Blender basics and the difference between orthographic and perspective mode. And so Lauren had some questions about how that worked, and we kind of talked through that a little bit more, but tonight is a good example of when I would use this. That's kind of in a much more useful setting than just, educational, theoretical. So if I start rendering this, I've set up basically 4 lamps, and then I've got no material on the pipe or anything at all right now. But basically I've set my camera up to be from an orthographic perspective. And so you can see again from this angle how everything's very flat. I'm exactly from at a 90-degree angle to the side of the pipe, and there's no distorted, perspective leading away or towards the camera. And so it's giving me a perfect silhouette outline of all my stuff here. Now, this is different compared to a scene where I have the exact same setup with the same camera, but I have it in perspective mode. And here we've got angles and foreshortening happening. So if I start rendering this, you'll notice that things that are closer to us appear bigger. And as they move away from the camera, they start to kind of get a little smaller. In this case, we're using sort of a mid-range to telephoto focal length. But this is a lot more obvious if you use something that's at the wider end of the spectrum. So this is 85 millimeters is typically like a portrait lens. And I like to use more of a telephoto look for my hard surface stuff. But if we were to change this down to something like an 18 millimeter lens, and then I were to reposition the camera so that it's right up next to this object again, you're going to see a much more distorted representation of how this object looks. And I've got depth of field turned on, so some of this is going to be blurred because of the focus of the camera is off, but you can see what I'm talking about. Everything up close towards the camera is big, and as it gets further away, and the pipe is only 6 inches long, but it's going to get smaller and smaller. So it's wildly changing and distorting our perspective of what's going on because of the focal length of this lens. And this only gets worse the lower you go. So 8 millimeters would be in the fisheye realm of a lens. And so as it's super close to the front of the lens here, you can see it's wildly distorted, and this is not even retaining the shape of the pipe anymore. This doesn't even look like the pipe really looks. Now this is a perfectly legitimate camera angle, and it's photorealistic. I mean, this is exactly what it would look like in real life, but that's the power of using different camera lenses and focal lengths and orthographic versus perspective. And you even got a panoramic version here. So panoramic will let you completely render an entire environment with, again, a fisheye lens or whatever. And so here, if we want to use a fisheye lens, again, we'll go back down to 8 millimeters, and I zoom in on the front of this object. And as it gets closer to the front of this lens, it's going to distort. And I'm going to just turn off the depth of field here so we can keep the, but this is just moving left to right with this. You can see how it completely wraps and distorts the pipe. And so just like a fisheye lens would. And here it looks like I'm in front of the object when, again, I'm not really, I'm next to it, but that makes it feel that way. And then you've got other options here for different ways to distort. So you've got fisheye, which is typical what you would see. You've got mirror ball, which is more for environments. And then you got equirectangular, which will distort in 180 degrees left to right. So it's a lot of cool things you can do here. And again, it's not meant for still objects. It's meant for environments. But again, that's the difference. You got orthographic here, or again, even from an angle, as I'm rotating around, this object is all in the same perspective in terms of dimensionality. There's no foreshortening going on. Same scale, top to bottom, and then perspective. You're again going to be really distorted depending on this. Now, 35 millimeters is more of a typical mid-range type of lens, but you can see again, the front of this ball is very distorted, then it gets small. But if you go at the other end and you go to 200 millimeters for a telephoto lens, and this is more like what you'd see at like a sporting event, you're getting a lot closer to that orthographic view. And again, it's just because the lens perspective changes the way this looks. So something to learn about and pay attention to and keep in mind. So Lauren's asking, when we render, we're flattening the scene into 2D. And that's kind of a good way to summarize what's going on with orthographic, is it's taking out all the perspective. So perspective, whether it's two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or there's even another dimensional type of perspective that allows you to warp straight lines into curved lines. But anyways, yeah, it takes all of those lines that would typically converge at a vanishing point, whether it's on the horizon line or top to bottom, and it straightens those back out to where they're all parallel to each other. So again, look at perspective, study that a little bit. Typical terms you'll find are horizon line, which is exactly what it sounds like, to help you gauge where you are in the scene. And then you've got vanishing points, which is what lines converge to in terms of perspective lines. And all that stuff is important to learn because it helps you understand how 3D works even better. But basically the way this is set up is I've got 2 or 3 setups here on different layers for different angles of the cameras. So if we go back to one of these, like right here, this one's for the bottom, this one's for the back. So hit Control-0 and I'll jump into this camera view here. And all I've done is created 4 lights. And so these are all area lights. They have different strengths, as you can see here. So these are pretty strong in terms of their output. And because of the different angles and different strengths, some of these are backlights, which are very, very powerful and strong. And then the ones sort of by the camera is a lot lower, just because it's not as important to highlight that. And then at the top, I've got a top light that's sort of in between all of these. And so when we render this, you're going to get a very strong backlit rim light around the object, which highlights the silhouette and is a good way to show off your hard surface objects. And so if you look at the edge here, you'll see a little rim light around the pipe and the stem here. And again, that just helps you see it as a viewer, helps you read the object a little better as you're trying to show this off. And then you've got a lot of dynamic shadows happening here because of all the lights coming from different angles. And so the more you can show the way the shadows wrap around your objects, the better people are going to be able to understand the complexity of the forms that you've modeled. If you blow out, one side of it where it's just really, really bright because the light's too close to it or something, it's gonna wash out all your details. And so that's a classic example of, needing to take more time to figure out a good angle for your lighting setup in your camera. And this is something I would highly recommend you guys get in here and just play with to kind of dial in with basic objects, cubes, spheres, whatever, what some interesting lighting angles are and what tricks you guys can come up with for creating some interesting shadows and things like that on your objects. So Lauren's asking, does it reduce the 3D scene down into a 2D view? And that's kind of a good way to think about it. Again, like the best thing I can do for you as an example is to kind of show you with this like a cube. So let me turn on the grid here. Let's reposition and add a cube. Okay. So we have a cube here that's sitting on the ground, okay? And right now I'm rotating around, but I'm in orthogonal view, and we're not gonna play with cameras or anything like that, but if you go to view and then you hit numpad 5 or you check this off, you can toggle between your perspective view or your orthogonal view and orthographic view. And the easiest way to see this is, again, orthographic view, all of the verticals and horizontal edges are going to be parallel to each other. So if you look at all 3 vertical sides of this cube in terms of the edges, in orthographic view, they're straight up and down, okay? And that means, again, everything's flattened, so you have no perspective. And if you were to stack tons of these cubes up side by side, all of those would be parallel too. So no matter how far away they get into the distance, even if I duplicate a bunch of them, as long as I'm in orthogonal view, all of the verticals are parallel to each other. Now, the second I switch into perspective view, so I'm gonna hit 5 on my numpad, now we have perspective. And now the verticals are not parallel to each other. They're converging way down underneath my screen somewhere towards what's called a vanishing point. And so the more extreme the angle or the lens that we have on in terms of our eyesight, the more extreme this is going to get. So in our 3D viewport, we actually are looking through what's considered a camera. And if we jump down into the view settings here, you'll see a lens setting. Now this doesn't go to any camera, it just goes to your perspective in the 3D viewport. So typically this will be at 35 by default. I change it to 50 because 50 is what the human eye sees typically when you're walking around. It's closest to your real vision in real life. But if we switch this to like 18, again, you're gonna see way, way, way distorted verticals. And again, think of these like railroad tracks or whatever, they're all converging towards a point in the distance that's in the horizon out here, okay? And again, this is only this distorted because we're picking such a wide angle lens. If we pick something like 100, we get a lot closer to being parallel once again, up and down. And again, you're never really gonna be perfectly parallel unless you're in orthogonal view like this. Because anytime there's perspective, even with a high focal range, focal length here, these are still going to converge somewhere on a vanishing point. But again, we can get into that more. This is especially important if you're going to learn how to draw in Photoshop or do concept art or whatever. Perspective is everything. Being able to understand how to manually plot perspective for any kind of object. I'm learning how to do it right now with humans. It's very complicated. Because you have to maintain proper proportions for the human body and anatomy and for shortening and different positions that the human body is in for poses and things like that. And so all of that has to be plotted in your head as you go and then drawn according to what's ever in proper perspective. So again, you have to think about like what focal length am I at as you're drawing on paper as well. That's all important. All right, guys, that's basically all I have time for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we will be talking about Blender 2.78. I'll show you how to grab a latest version of that, and we will be digging into some of those features. Mostly, I'll just be playing around, and we'll see if we can get it to crash a few times, and I'm sure there's still some bugs in it that we need to work out, but there's some cool things to go over. So tune in for that. It's going to be an exciting time where we get to dig into the new features of the software coming up. Again, that's going to be the official release is going to be on October 20th. There's going to be beta release before then, but tune in tomorrow night, 7 p.m., same channel, same time for a sneak peek at Blender 2.8. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in tonight. I'll see you tomorrow night. And if you would like to see more training, head on over to theorangeguild.com. This is my personal training platform for Blender artists. And so if you would like to come here, check out, it's $9 a month, $99 a year for unlimited courses. And so all of these courses are right now, they're live, and you can see how to build cars and things like that. We got free training coming out soon. And of course, I'll be doing a 2.8 course as Blender is released later in the year. But definitely check this out. It is an amazing site, and we are getting more and more people every day interested in joining and being a part of the guild. So I would love to have you be a part of it. And it's super affordable, and it won't be as amazing if you're not part of it. So definitely check out theorangeguild.com, and I'll see you inside. So Lorian has one more question. She says, would a beginner like me want to get the preliminary version of 2.8? I would highly suggest, as we get into tomorrow night, I'll be talking about this more and more, but as we talk about getting into 2.8, I know it's going to be a little intimidating, especially if you just started learning 2.79, but 2.8 is going to be the standard from here on in. The last time we had this major of a shift in the way things looked and felt was 2.5 Blender. And so it's been several years, maybe about 10 since something this big hit, and it's going to be a massive upgrade to the workflow. Things are going to get faster, easier to use. There's going to be even more ways to customize, save your settings, and it's going to be even more fun to get in there and play with. So trust me, you're going to want to be part of it. It's absolutely free, just like all the other versions of Blender. So are the preliminary versions to download and test at any time you want. There's new rendering engines, new features, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, tune in tomorrow night. We'll talk about it then, and be thinking of questions between now and then that you guys want to talk about. And I'll be happy to kind of delve into those with you. So hope you guys have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central, and stay cool out there.